Economics in Action, a podcast where we explore topics and ideas related to economics. In this episode, we'll be examining recent news of the slowdown in China's economic growth and declining productivity. In particular, we'll be looking at the concept of total factor productivity, which measures the efficiency with which an economy uses its inputs, such as labor and capital, to produce outputs like goods and services. We'll be answering some basic questions such as, what is total factor productivity? What are the different sources of greater productivity? And how is it measured? But first, let's highlight some of the recent news about China's economy. There have been a spate of recent news articles highlighting China's declining GDP estimates, the troubled housing market, and the aging demographic trends. Big banks like JP Morgan and Barclays have recently downgraded their GDP forecast for China from over 6% to around 4.5% for 2023. And this is just a continuation of a broader trend of declining economic performance from the heydays of 10% average annual growth in the 80s and 90s. While slowing economic growth paints a picture of recent trends, when economists want to forecast long-term economic growth, they typically look at three things: increases and decreases in the capital stock, increases and decreases in labor inputs such as workers' hours, and finally, total factor productivity. However, countries can't just grow at breakneck speeds forever, like China has, by increasing capital and labor inputs. This is because there are diminishing returns to these factors, meaning that adding extra units of workers or machines gets you less and less bang for your buck the more you already have. What you really want to look at is total factor productivity. And in a recent article in the Wall Street Journal, there is data from the Lowy Institute, a think tank based out of Sydney, Australia, showing that over the past few decades, measures of China's total factor productivity have declined from around 5% year-over-year growth in the 1980s to less than 1.5% from the 2010s onward. So what is going on here? Let's first explain a little bit more clearly what total factor productivity is. Essentially, it's an indicator of how well an economy is leveraging its resources to generate growth beyond what can be attributed to increases in the quantity of inputs alone. To understand total factor productivity, it's essential to first grasp the basic idea of production functions in economics. A production function represents the relationship between inputs, like labor and capital, and outputs, goods and services. If an economy can produce more output with the same amount of input, or the same output with less input, it is said to be more productive. However, over time, simply adding more labor or capital will yield diminishing returns, like we mentioned earlier. This means that if you keep adding more workers to a factory without increasing the amount of machinery or improving technology, each additional worker will contribute less and less to output. Similarly, just adding more machines without training workers to use them effectively won't result in proportional increases in production. This is where total factor productivity comes into play. It captures the portion of output growth that cannot be explained by growth in inputs. In other words, it represents the increase in output that's not due to more labor or more capital, but it is instead a result of using these inputs more efficiently. For instance, consider two countries with the same amount of labor and capital. If one country produces more goods and services than the other, it's likely because it has a higher total factor productivity. But what are these other mysterious sources of efficiency in productivity? Well, this efficiency can arise from multiple sources, but the main three that are often cited are technologies, institutions, and human capital. And it's important to note that they all sort of depend on and feed into each other. Let's go through each of these really quickly, using China as an example. Technology can be seen not only as things that a country possesses, like high-speed rail, supercomputers, or supersonic military jets, but also ideas. These can be ideas about how to make things, like the idea of using sand or silicon dioxide to make computer chips like they do in Taiwan, or the ideas to employ existing technology for alternative purposes, such as QR codes and online payment systems to make China an almost cashless society. These ideas don't even need to come from inside the country. Many of the ideas China has employed have come from the outside in agreements for technology sharing when a foreign country enters the Chinese markets, or even ideas that were stolen through cyber theft. Good ideas are hard to come by, though, and require lots of research, smart people, and long-term investment. That brings us to the second source of total factor productivity, which are institutions. Institutions are basically how things operate in society and feed into technology because good institutions can lead to creating incentives for people to create good ideas. For example, rule of law, which is a really important factor. And these can heavily influence the incentives of people in an economy. In China, there are certainly laws governing people's behavior, but sometimes they aren't applied evenly and can be used at the discretion of China's ruling Communist Party. Other institutions include things like regulations and ease of doing business, property rights, and all the other cultural and social norms that govern people's behavior. Lastly, human capital, which are the skills and knowledge humans acquire from schooling or on-the-job training, are also critical for long-term growth. Human capital feeds back into technology as the development of human capital allows for the production of good ideas, as well as institutions when strong cultural emphasis is placed on learning and scientific inquiry. While difficult to measure, most estimates have shown that this has improved in the past few decades in China, but is still behind most developed countries. A crude measure is the estimates of the percentage of age 24 to 60-year-old workers with a high school degree. China is at 36.6%, whereas countries like South Korea and the OECD countries are around 80%. So how is total factor productivity measured? Let's go back to the production function. One of the most widely used production functions in economics is known as the Cobb-Douglas production function. Developed by Charles Cobb and Paul Douglas in the 20th century, this function has become a standard tool for analyzing production in micro and macroeconomic contexts, and it describes how different inputs like capital and labor come together to produce an output. The Cobb-Douglas production function is expressed mathematically as total output equaling total factor productivity multiplied by labor inputs raised to the alpha power multiplied by capital inputs raised to the beta power. This might be hard to visualize, so let's run through a quick example. Suppose we make total factor productivity equal to 1. Then we want to see how much would be produced in our economy with 10 workers and 10 machines. Well, that would depend on our alpha and beta terms. Let's set alpha equal to 2/3 and beta equal to 1/3. Then 10 units of labor raised to the 2/3 power multiplied by 10 units of capital raised to the 1/3 power equals roughly 10 units of output. On a side note, because these exponents are equal to 1, that means that this economy would have constant returns to scale. In other words, if they doubled their inputs, their outputs would also be doubled. Now imagine that instead of our total factor productivity term being equal to 1, it's now increased to 2. We would double our output to 20 units. Or imagine if it was halved. Then we'd only get 5 units of output. So as we can see, total factor productivity plays a big role. But how do economists figure out what the total factor productivity term should be? Well, when economists want to figure out how much an economy has grown, they often use the residual method. First, they estimate how many more people there are working and how many more machines and equipment businesses bought. This gives them an idea of how much growth they should expect. Then, when they compare this expected growth to the actual growth in the economy, sometimes there's a gap. The economy has grown more than what just adding more workers and machines would explain. What's left over, that extra bit of growth, is attributed to total factor productivity. It's like finding out how much of a student's improved grades comes from studying harder, the expected part, and how much comes from just getting smarter or developing better study techniques, the total factor productivity or secret sauce part. However, there are challenges to measuring total factor productivity. One of the main challenges stems from the challenges associated with accurately measuring the inputs and outputs used in its calculation. Total factor productivity aims to capture the residual difference between observed output and what can be attributed to the inputs like labor and capital. However, collecting comprehensive and reliable data on these inputs is often difficult, especially in certain sectors or economies with limited resources. For instance, in the case of labor input, total factor productivity calculations might rely on metrics like total hours worked, which might not account for variations in the quality of labor. Different workers might have varying levels of skill and experience that contribute differently to productivity. But these nuances are not often captured adequately in total factor productivity calculations. Similarly, measuring capital inputs can be challenging, particularly when dealing with intangible assets like intellectual property, brand value, and organizational knowledge. These types of assets can significantly contribute to a firm's productivity, but assigning precise values to them is complex. Nevertheless, total factor productivity is still seen as the most important contributor to long-term economic growth, especially for countries that are further along their development path and have already accrued enough capital inputs. However, reforms and improvements to total factor productivity can be difficult, especially if institutional changes require political changes that just aren't feasible in many countries. Thanks for listening. If you like this episode, please subscribe or write a comment telling us what you like about the show.